January 26, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Austin Tyson Angle. Royal Rumble results, and more. By Observer staff. After a tremendous angle on the live January 19th Warzone hour of Raw from Fresno, California, where Austin, the WWF's hottest commodity, and Tyson, the currently suspended biggest drawing card in pro boxing, went nose to nose, the WWF received tons of mainstream international publicity. The angle, which started when a heavily booed Vince McMahon brought an even more heavily booed Tyson and his entourage into the ring. Just when McMahon was going to make the announcement of Tyson's role in WrestleMania, Austin showed up. Austin challenged Tyson while McMahon did his best acting job to appear upset at the misbehavior of his top star. Austin ended up flipping Tyson off with both hands, resulting in Tyson shoving Austin, a major pull-apart brawl resulting in McMahon acting completely infuriated at Austin ruining his deal, acting like he himself was out of control and had to be held back by his son from going after Austin. After a commercial break backstage, McMahon apologized to Tyson for the behavior of Austin. Tyson called Austin a on Barry Diller's USA Network no less, and said that he wanted to fight him. The WWF then released word, carried by AP Worldwide, that Tyson had challenged Austin and that the WWF would be meeting with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, which suspended Tyson for his chomping on the ears of Evander Holyfield in his last boxing match, to see if it would be okay to make Tyson a participant. As mentioned in last week's Observer, Mark Ratner, who heads the Nevada Commission and is an avid pro wrestling fan, had already declared that he considered pro wrestling as staged entertainment and felt that Tyson and the WWF would be free to do whatever they felt like doing short of putting Tyson in the ring wearing boxing gloves without it affecting Tyson's chances of getting reinstated to boxing in July. Many media outlets on January 20th were reporting Tyson versus Austin is almost a done deal, since Ratner made it clear to media that asked after the angle, the commission, thought to be the lone holdup, would have no problem should Tyson do the match. However, at press time there was still much speculation as to what actually will happen at WrestleMania. Other media outlets were still reporting Tyson would referee at WrestleMania, and the WWF had officially released no information conclusively other than continue the storyline, which we're told has many weeks to go before everything is clear. The angle received a tremendous amount of mainstream pub, carried in most newspapers and as a top sports story that evening and the next morning on radio and on shows like ESPN SportsCenter and Fox Sports. Nearly all the coverage was derogatory, but that was to be expected going in. The AP story, which ran almost everywhere, actually implied that the angle was a shoot, as did the USA Today mention, in that it said Tyson was going to be a referee, but after the confrontation with Austin, he changed his mind and wanted to be a participant against Austin. It was also front-page news with a large photo in virtually every sports section in Japan, where Tyson's name has a lot of mystique and where mainstream coverage of pro wrestling events is far more accepted. But a few things are clear. One is that Tyson's run with the WWF has to end with him being a babyface, which clearly won't be an easy feat considering his status with the general public, but if nothing else, pro wrestling is a world where the public is usually easily manipulated. Tyson was booed out of the building both in San Jose and Fresno when making appearances at WWF shows. The other is that Tyson will take absolutely no injury risk at all in his involvement. Pro wrestling can be as easy or as hard physically as the participants allow it to be. You can do a totally safe match, which would, particularly with a largely untrained participant, likely be boring, although crowds are more forgiving with bigger names, even bigger names they don't really like. Or you can take more and more risks to add excitement. There is no question the original plan for WrestleMania was for Austin to win the WWF title from Shawn Michaels, but obviously something like this takes precedence. Within pro wrestling in the days leading up to the angle, there were people saying that Tyson would wind up as a participant, while most of the word was that Tyson would end up being a referee in the Austin vs. Michaels match. If the latter story was accurate, due to the price tag of the deal, thought to be between $4 million and $6 million, with our generally best information leading toward the latter figure as being more accurate when all is said and done, to make Tyson a drawing card in a referee role would have required a series of spectacular angles and a great storyline. Simply put, if the $4 million figure is accurate, the WWF needs 648,000 buys out of WrestleMania, 2.2 buy rate to make out financially, and if the real figure is $6 million, it would need about 807,000 buys, 2.7 buy rate. These are not figures to break even, but figures to make out based on Tyson adding the revenue offsetting his cost. Actual break even would be lower. No matter what, it needs a series of great angles and great interviews, which Austin can provide. It may need even more than that if Tyson will only be a referee. The recent Hulk Hogan vs. Sting match did about a 1.9 buy rate, which was the biggest of the past 6 years. WWF did about a 1.5 buy rate for the Lawrence Taylor vs. Bam Bam Bigelow match, which was hyped tremendously, but ultimately was a huge disappointment because Taylor's drawing power wasn't nearly as big outside the New York/Connecticut area as the company, being based in that area, expected. Plus Bigelow 3 years ago wasn't the star Austin is today. But Taylor was the catalyst for a period where Raw's ratings made a noticeable upward surge. Nor was wrestling anywhere near as popular 3 years ago as it is today. At its peak, which would be the WrestleManias from 1988 to 1990, the show peaked at about 750,000 buys with a far smaller total universe than is equipped for pay-per-view today. And as much mainstream publicity as those shows received, it would pale in comparison to what would be the case if Tyson was a participant. As a referee, the economics and the promotion of it are a lot trickier. Still, there is a lot more than just one pay-per-view that this affects. We were also talking about attempting to re-establish the WWF as the brand name for wrestling in the United States, a distinction that slowly was slipping away over the past year, not to mention to try and take a dent out of the ratings domination by WCW over the past 19 months. We were also talking about the chance to create the next generation of Hogan and Pipers who can get over past just the wrestling audience and expose them to the mainstream and draw for the next 15 years off the name established during this boom period. It worked for Hogan and Piper at the first WrestleMania. It didn't work for Wendy Richter at the first, nor for Bigelow 10 years later when they tried to recreate the formula. This whole scenario also brings to mind the 1976 boxer versus wrestler with Muhammad Ali, then the boxing world heavyweight champion, and the biggest sports figure of his time, against Antonio Inoki. That event disintegrated into a disaster. First off, while the event got a ton of mainstream media publicity, and probably more than this one will get as far as taking anyone it seriously because Ali then was a far bigger and more respected name than Tyson now and he held the title at the time. But the boxing fans didn't buy the match because they didn't know Inoki and there was still the idea that this was part of a fake pro wrestling promotion. The wrestling fans didn't really take to it because wrestling was regionalized in those days and most of the regional promoters didn't like the idea of the fight since they saw it as something Inoki was doing for himself and couldn't see how it could help their regional business because even if Inoki won, it wasn't like he was going to come and appear in their cities. They didn't want to spend time getting Inoki or the show over, and virtually all didn't push the match that hard on their television as opposed to the angles they were running internally, so it really wasn't that big a deal to pro wrestling fans at the time either, even though it was the first promotion nationwide up to that point in pro wrestling history. The result, people for the most part didn't buy the closed circuit and the event, outside of the Northeast where Bruno Sammartino and Stan Hansen saved the box office, was a financial flop. Because the match was taken seriously and not as comedy as this one will be, the talks about the finish fell apart as has been noted in these pages numerous times. The match turned into a disastrous shoot almost totally lacking in action. Because once the worked aspect fell apart, Ali and his people wouldn't allow Ali into the ring with Inoki unless all kinds of rules were made to handicap what Inoki could do offensively as they feared an injury to Ali that would cost everyone money. Probably the other show that got the most mainstream sports publicity in the United States on a national basis was the first WrestleMania, where actor Mr. T teamed with Hogan against Paul Orndorff and Piper in a closed-circuit extravaganza in 1985 that was considered a huge gamble at the time and had it not paid off would have undoubtedly changed the entire course of the history of this industry. It was a gamble that paid off big as it put the WWF, Hogan and Piper over the top in a series of small-time promotional wars against various popular local entities and wound up with the company getting occasional late-night slots on NBC. In this case, McMahon will do a tremendous job on his television in getting the match over because he has no choice but to do so, and it comes at a time when interest in pro wrestling in general is at one of its strongest points ever. The media will make snide remarks, but it'll get enough coverage that everyone will know about it. It still may not translate into buys from boxing fans, but unlike Ali Inoki, it will from wrestling fans, and with Tyson added to the mix, there may be enough to make it financially worthwhile. WCW, which has no problem spending money, bowed out of attempting to steal the Tyson deal largely due to feeling the figures thrown out couldn't be justified. It'll be interesting at the end of March to see not only how the story plays out in the storyline, but at WrestleMania, and when it comes to financial acumen, which side was correct. Due to Martin Luther King Day, no ratings information was available at press time for January 19th when WWF debuted Tyson in the ring doing an interview. Something that the company and the USA Network had heavily publicized all week. Neither Tyson nor Austin appeared until the final 15 minutes of the show, which also teased throughout a late-in-the-show Undertaker appearance, a period after WCW had already gone off the air, leading one to believe USA drew a tremendous rating in the final quarter hour. To counter the Tyson hype, WCW at first led viewers to believe on Thursday that Hulk Hogan would be handed the WCW title back due to a court order on Nitro, a storyline that was never referred to on either Saturday or Monday's show, and instead, to counter the Tyson appearance. Hype to Hogan versus the Giant singles match, which Hogan put Giant over clean with a choke slam in. There are a few schools of thought as to how this will turn out. Tyson does a singles match with Austin. It ends with some heels, likely DX, interfering and Tyson and Austin cleaning house back-to-back and shaking hands at the end of the big babyface pop that will be carried by media worldwide that Tyson and his people are looking for out of this deal. Perhaps DX could cost Austin the match. In that way they don't have to ask Tyson to lose and people at least get a finish out of the match. Tyson can then not accept an unfair win, once again making him a babyface at the end. This would lead to the Austin-Michaels match, perhaps at King of the Ring, where Austin would get the title win, which would make up for the loss. Or they can go without a finish, although that scenario would seem to make the least sense both for future business and for the ultimate fan reaction to the show, but would protect Austin. Tyson can do some angles before the show that end up with him liking Austin somehow, probably with something similar to the aforementioned scenario, and they can work a tag match together. That way they can do a long match. Tyson only has to do a few well-choreographed spots with pro workers the caliber of Michaels and Helmsley, and Austin can carry the action. All four get the media rub from being in the ring with Tyson. Tyson can KO Helmsley while Austin can stunner Michaels for a double win. Tyson ends up as a referee at the end, after doing an angle somewhere that somehow Tyson was forced out of the match. Boxing writer Dean Julep of the Las Vegas Sun on January 20th wrote a column where he claimed Tyson's PR man, Sig Rojich, knew the Nevada Commission really isn't crazy about Tyson being involved in pro wrestling, but doesn't have the legal power in which to stop him because he was only suspended from boxing. So that's why they are publicly stating he can do what he wants. Julep claimed the trick for Rojich and the WWF would be to create a scenario to wind up with Tyson as a referee but having the commission not hold it against him. Julep wrote, "Mark these words, the WWF will milk this, perhaps even petitioning the Nevada State Athletic Commission for its approval on Tyson's behalf. The commission, however, will be noncommittal, not that its members' comments won't fill many a newspaper story. Tyson will eventually hedge on his participation and, at some point before March 29th, Rojich will say his man has reconsidered and is definitely withdrawing as a participant in a wrestling bout in May, in fact, also withdraw as a referee." Rojich, with feigned innocence, can then approach the Nevada State Athletic Commission at Tyson's reinstatement hearing and say, "Gentlemen, Mr. Tyson, good man that he is, resisted the monetary gain and the urge to wrestle back in March, demonstrating not only his good intentions but proving he is reformed and deserving of a boxing license. And let's add one more. Austin turns down the match with Tyson, saying he's going to win the WWF title from Michaels at WrestleMania. This puts the belt over huge that he turned down a match that would get a ton of publicity worldwide because the most important thing is winning the WWF title. Now he can't puss out, so he can say that he's going to Mania to win the title, and then after the match he's going to beat up Tyson. Tyson demands to get as close to the situation as possible and ends up as a ref, with him teasing all along that with Tyson, who hates Austin, as the ref, that Austin has no chance of winning the title, but that if Tyson screws Austin, what will happen live after the match is over? And when all is said and done, DX attacks both several times, or even just attacks Austin, but Tyson ends up doing the right thing as a referee, leading to them joining forces with the double knockout finish, and he counts the 3 for the title change. Austin gets the title so people are happy. Tyson ends his brief wrestling career with cheers, a scene that makes every newscast in the country that evening and becomes the last impression the public has of Tyson, erasing the previous impression of him eating some ear. They get whatever buys then can out of the lure of an Austin-Tyson street fight but never actually sanction that it will happen. And like everything in wrestling today, they tease one thing and figure out a way to get out of actually delivering it. While there are many on the inside of this who believe the third scenario is as close to the truth as is out there, $6 million doesn't make economic sense on the surface to pay someone who won't be participating in the match unless you're telling everyone he's definitely going to be in a fight. In San Jose, Tyson was in the luxury boxes at the arena with Shane McMahon, and at some points with Vince McMahon, cheering on the babyfaces, in particular his favorite, at least on that night, Cold Stoned. The next night, he was all over the television, arriving with Shane McMahon in a limo, good-naturedly shaking hands and telling stories with the old-timers like Pat Patterson, Arnold Skolland, Tony Garea, Jerry Briscoe, Sergeant Slaughter and Blackjack Lanza, doing skits with DX, the Nation of Domination. Sonny and finally getting into the ring, and get this, telling Vince McMahon in a booming voice that his favorite wrestler was Vince's longtime enemy Bruno Sammartino to make it look like the situation in the ring was a shoot to set up the angle, which was pulled off magnificently. Bobo Brazil. Career title history. Source: Wrestling Title History's 3rd edition. Editor's note: this list could only be described as partial as there are no accurate complete wrestling records of the 50s and 60s. NWA International. Defeated Giant Baba June 25, 1968 Nagoya. Lost to Giant Baba June 27, 1968 Tokyo. Awarded title December 1, 1972 after Baba left JWA. Lost to Kentaro Oki December 4, 1972 Hiroshima. WWA Heavyweight California version. Defeated Buddy Austin September 2, 1966 Los Angeles. Lost to Buddy Austin September 16, 1966 Los Angeles. Defeated Buddy Austin January 12, 1968 Los Angeles. Title vacated when WWA joined NWA and gave up recognizing a World Heavyweight Champion. NWA United States Heavyweight Michigan/Ohio version. Defeated Dick the Bruiser January 21, 1961 Detroit. Lost to Dick the Bruiser February 28, 1961 Detroit. Defeated the Sheik August 1967. Lost to the Sheik October 1967. These 2 title victories not recognized in Detroit, where Sheik remained champion for 6 years. Defeated the Sheik May 29, 1971 Detroit. Lost to Pampero Firpo August 12, 1972 in Detroit. Def Pampero Firpo August 19, 1972 Detroit. Lost to Pampero Firpo October 28, 1972 Detroit. Defeated Pampero Firpo December 23, 1972 Detroit. Lost to the Sheik December 30, 1972 Detroit. Defeated the Sheik January 13, 1973 Detroit. Lost to the Sheik January 27, 1973 Detroit. Awarded title January 25, 1975 when Sheik missed show in Detroit. Lost to Abdullah the Butcher February 8, 1975 Detroit. Defeated Abdullah the Butcher April 19, 1975 Detroit. Lost to the Sheik July 7, 1975 Detroit. NWA World Tag Team, Michigan/Ohio version. With Lord Athol Layton defeated Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch August 8, 1970 Detroit. Titles vacated when Layton did injury angle. With Tony Marino defeated Kurt Von Hess and Carl Von Schotz 1974. Titles held up after match with Ben Justice and Tim Brooks 1974. With Tony Marino defeated Ben Justice and Tim Brooks June 15, 1974 Detroit. Lost to Tim Brooks and Abdullah the Butcher 1974. With Tony Marino defeated Tim Brooks and Abdullah the Butcher. With Fred Curry defeated the Mongols, Tatri Newton and Bill Eadie, November 1974. Lost to Angelo and Lanny Poffo January 1975. NWA America's Heavyweight, Southern California. Defeated El Mongol October 4, 1968 Los Angeles. Lost to Fred Blassie January 10, 1969 Los Angeles. Defeated Fred Blassie February 7, 1969 Los Angeles. Lost to the Sheik February 21, 1969 Los Angeles. NWA United States Heavyweight, Northern California. Defeated Kinji Shibuya October 16, 1965 San Francisco. Lost to Kinji Shibuya November 13, 1965 San Francisco. NWA United States Ontario version. Defeated the Sheik February 6, 1977 Toronto. Lost to the Sheik February 27, 1977 Toronto. Canadian Open Tag Team title. With Whipper Billy Watson defeated Reggie Crusher and Stan Lisowski May 22, 1958. Lost to Ivan and Nikita Kalmykov June 12, 1958. WWA Indiana Heavyweight. Defeated Johnny Valiant July 24, 1981 Bartonville, Illinois. Lost to Blackjack Mulligan October 11, 1981. WWF United States Heavyweight. Wrestled occasionally in 1976 around the WWF build as United States Champion. We don't have much in the way of details on this, but at about 3:30 a.m. on January 20th, Houston Harris, real name Bobo Brazil, passed away at Lakeland Medical Center in St. Joseph, Michigan due to complications from a stroke he had suffered a few weeks earlier. Bobo Brazil was one of the most famous names in pro wrestling internationally from the mid-50s through the 70s. When he first made it big in the 50s, he was known in the profession as the most physically massive athlete in the game, being about 6'4" and 280 pounds without much body fat at a time when people just weren't that large and thick. As legend had it, Harris was playing semi-pro baseball for a team in the old Negro League in the late 1940s. During that time period, baseball, like most sports, were segregated. In Minneapolis when he was spotted by wrestling legend Jumping Joe Saboldi, who, seeing his size and athletic ability, trained him for pro wrestling. He was given one of the great ring names of the era and sent to California, where he was an immediate hit for promoter Joe Malsuix in San Francisco. and then became a box office attraction for Pedro Martinez in Buffalo, New York, and remained on top for nearly 4 decades. In his early career, in many territories, he was only allowed to wrestle other black wrestlers due to the mores of society, hence his billing in those days as the Negro World Heavyweight Champion. Indeed, he was brought into many cities because he was such a popular babyface across the board to break the color barrier, so to speak, and wrestle against white heel opponents. Because of his popularity, such a breakthrough that seemed huge at the time was accomplished with limited racial problems. In a correction to last week's story, when he won the WWA World Heavyweight title in Los Angeles in 1966, he would not have been the first black man to hold a World Heavyweight title recognized in a major promotion, as Bearcat Wright held that same title in 1963. Other wrestlers remember Brazil, a powerful lumbering man who often teamed with smaller high flyers such as Sweet Daddy Siki and Dory Dixon in the early 60s, as being one of the most well-liked people in the business. Although he was always a star and rarely asked to do jobs, he had no reputation for balking if asked. There was little in the way of resentment for him in a business where being on top, particularly since he had no real wrestling background, can often breed such a reaction, not to mention him being a headliner in a business that is usually well behind the times when it comes to racial relations and that would naturally have more than its fair share of people with bad attitudes toward racial problems during the turbulent 60s. There were never stories about him walking out of territories or getting into backstage problems with other wrestlers. That may have been at least partially due to his size and an aura he possessed where he in person seemed larger than life and even bigger than he really was due to having such a thick bone structure, and thus nobody really wanted to test him out. During the 1960s, he ranked on the same level with Gene Kiniski and Bruno Sammartino and right behind Fritz von Erich as being the biggest foreign draw in the Orient. He was the only person over a many-year time frame to beat Giant Baba in a singles match in Japan. Although a great attraction in many territories, he actually didn't have that many NWA or WWF title matches. The AWA was notorious throughout its history for not booking many black wrestlers on top. He had numerous matches against Luthez, a few with Gene Kiniski, the most famous being the Los Angeles time limit draw after the WWA title was disbanded, but only one each against subsequent champs Dory Funk Jr., a 60-minute draw in of all places Augusta, Georgia, which drew a sellout crowd at the Civic Center, and Jack Briscoe, a 60-minute draw at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis in 1974 with Briscoe trying to work Hill, which was actually considered one of the worst main events of that era in that city and combined with only drawing an average 8,800 sized crowd, which is why they were never brought back for a rematch. They also had one of the very few face versus face WWF title matches of that era, going to a double disqualification against Sammartino in a famous Philadelphia match in the late 60s. There didn't figure to be much in the way of surprises to the end results of the 11th annual Royal Rumble on January 18th from the San Jose, California arena. It was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Steve Austin would win the Rumble, and that Kane would cost Undertaker the WWF title match against Shawn Michaels, leading to their first singles match as the WrestleMania co-feature. So with that, it appeared the job of the show was to constantly tease that wasn't going to happen. As it was, the Rumble was a good pay-per-view to kick off the endless supply we'll be getting in 1998, ending a streak of bad pay-per-view shows that dated back several months. It wasn't a show of the year unless we were in for a very bad year from pro wrestling. The card was a basic sellout about a week in advance, totaling 18,542 in the building, the largest crowd ever to witness pro wrestling in Northern California, with 16,661 paying $414,373 and another $159,023 in merchandise. For Northern California, the crowd figure broke the all-time record of about 17,000 set for a 1962 match between Ray Stevens and Pepper Gomez at the San Francisco Cow Palace, which actually may have drawn more of a paid attendance because in those days they didn't give away almost any tickets. For Gate, it more than doubled the record of $192,000 set on February 23, 1997, with a Hulk Hogan vs. Roddy Piper Super Brawl show at the Cow Palace. It would be the third largest gate for pro wrestling ever in California, trailing only the 1991 Hulk Hogan vs. Sergeant Slaughter and 1996 Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels. WrestleManias held in Los Angeles and Anaheim respectively, and as best we can tell the third largest crowd in the state ever, trailing only the legendary Fred Blassie vs. John Tolos 1971 grudge match at the Los Angeles Coliseum, 25,000 plus, and the famous first $100,000 gate in history for the tremendously promoted Luthez vs. Baron Michel Leon NWA title match in 1952 at Hollywood Legion Stadium, 23,000. There may have been outdoor crowds of more than 18,500 in the 20s and 30s when pro wrestling was a big attraction in Los Angeles that I'm not aware of. There was a surprising lack of heat overall in the show live with the exception of the last 31 seconds of the Rumble itself. Although they popped for Undertaker's entrance and to a lesser extent for Shamrock and Michaels, it was mainly a crowd to see Austin and see the spectacle of the first major wrestling event ever in San Jose and really having a minimum of interest in anything else. The finish of the show where Undertaker was burned came off as more of a special effect than bringing out any sympathetic emotion for Undertaker, although part of that was because many in the live audience could see Undertaker sneak out of side door of the coffin before the fire spot. With the exception of Tyson, who was booed far more live than any heel on the show, the main focus on the show was the top two matches. The Rumble was an ordinary Rumble match below average as compared with the standard of the past several years, hampered once again by the WWF's lack of talent depth. There wasn't one spectacular performance in the match, but there were only a handful who were noticeably lame: Mark Henry, Ahmed Johnson, Kurgan and Phineas Godwin. There were no standout performances both from a working standpoint nor from a storyline standpoint, Kevin Diesel Nash or Steve Austin becoming a big star by owning the ring. Most of the time there were too many in the ring at the same time, thus not allowing for any real action other than punching, kicking and staying out of the way or focusing all that much on certain people and developing storylines. There were only a few angles, but that was just as well because if they had done any more than what they did, they'd have been forgotten and useless anyway. They started an Owen Hart versus Jeff Jarrett feud, and had Mick Foley come out as all three characters for momentary comedy. The Rumble itself actually contained 27 wrestlers, 29 if you include Foley as 3 people, with 1:45 between entrances advertised as 2 minutes but may have been cut down due to time constraints at that point in the show, a time period that seemed neither too long nor too short. After the television show went off the air with the cliffhanger ending of Undertaker burning to death inside a casket in the arena, they made it clear by opening the casket and finding no Undertaker that he had escaped, and then played an interview with Undertaker on the video wall where he vowed revenge on Kane. Still, haven't we seen that before a few times? The announcing, paying strict attention to eliminations, having at least a semblance of a storyline and being far more camera-friendly made this as a concept totally blow away the WCW's similar World War III Battle Royal. Overall, Jerry Lawler was even more witty than usual, and Jim Ross, having a good show to call, showed he's still the most complete announcer in the United States, actually by a very wide margin. Joey Styles was somewhat exposed when he had to do shows live, and for all his amazing knowledge of wrestling, Mike Tenay doesn't have the experience to be ranked in Ross League. Shawn Michaels put on another great performance in the main event against Undertaker, but after their classic Hell in a Cell match in October and with a weak finish this time out, the match ended up being anticlimactic, although easily the best match on the show. As it compares with recent big show matches, the body of the match was more spectacular than in the Keiji Muto vs Kensuke Sasaki Tokyo Dome main event, and it was better paced, but it didn't build as well to the finish nor come close in terms of psychology, so overall I'd rate the two as about equal. After watching both matches a second time, both bouts were well below the Rey Mysterio Jr. vs Juventud Guerrera title change from Thunder 3 nights earlier. The undercard was better than most recent WWF undercards. Vader vs Goldust and LOD vs Outlaws were below average, but couldn't be called stinkers. The minis had absolutely no heat, and the 70s idea of let's bring out the midgets for the kiddies shtick is entirely outdated and can't work with the current audience direction in which the minis could really only get a pop if one of the big guys pile drove all of them. But they had by far the most athletic match on the show, kept the comedy to a minimum and built to a great finish with nearly flawless execution of a lot of very difficult spots. Of course, none of that mattered to the crowd live and no doubt to the crowd on television as well. Rocky Maivia showed once again he's a genuine top star and given his level of experience and age, has the potential to be everything that was predicted of him when he started. Of the entire roster, he's the one most likely to turn the Big Three into the Big Four. It appears the next pay-per-view show, called No Way Out on February 15th in Houston, the final pay-per-view before Mania, looks to be mainly a transition show trying to heat up the various angles before the big show. At press time, the scheduled lineup is Austin and Hart and LOD vs Michaels and Helmsley and Outlaws, Vader vs Kane, Shamrock and Johnson and Chains and Skull, and 8-Ball vs Nation of Domination, so we can see more classic wrestling with Henry vs Johnson, Taka Michinoku defending the WWF Light Heavyweight title against Pantera from Promo Azteca, Mankind vs Mero and Chainsaw Charlie vs Ofka Goldust. 1. Vader, Leon White, pinned the Ofka Goldust in 7:47. Both worked hard but they were a little off. Actually, Goldust for the past few years has been a little off, although there were some good bumps and the match had a nice finish. Vader went up for the Vader bomb, but Luna did a run-in jumping on Vader's back. Vader climbed the ropes with Luna on his back, and did the Vader bomb with Luna on his back for added weight and got the pin. 1¼ stars. 2. Max Mini, formerly Mascarada Sagrada Jr., and Nova, formerly Mascarada Sagrada, and Mosaic, formerly Octagonchito, defeated Battalion, formerly Piratita Morgan, and Torito, formerly Espectrito I, real name Mario Jimenez, and Tarantula, formerly Espectrito II, real name Alejandro Jimenez, in 7:49. Sonny was the ref. The crowds now are only into seeing TV stars, and these guys don't qualify, so it really doesn't matter what they do. They can't get heat. So they did one great acrobatic spot after another to no crowd heat. Mosaic in particular, who is actually the most solid of all the face minis in Mexico, did all kinds of great moves. The first actual crowd reaction was Torito nailing Nova with a Kawada style kick. The only missed spot of the match was when Sonny was supposed to leapfrog Max, but they screwed it up and Max ended up crawling under her legs on the second try. They also did a comedy spot where Sonny held Max to allow him to dropkick two of his foes and set up a spinning head scissors on the third. Then came a series of dives, with Mosaic doing a flip dive that the cameras largely missed, Rita with a what a move, Pescado Max with this incredible double corkscrew springboard dive to the floor, Tarantula with a tope and climaxing with Nova doing an Osai moonsault. As Jim Ross joined Styles and Tenay as the only announcers in North America despite this move being used regularly in this country for nearly 2 years and actually recognizing it. Unlike Tony Schiavone, who screams out Asahi moonsault at all kinds of dives except an Osai moonsault. Max came off the top rope with a flying Hurricane Rana, then did a quick arm drag into a fast cradle for the pin. Jerry Lawler did a lot of Minis comedy and commentary, including saying that Max tried to commit suicide by jumping off a curb. Sonny seemed almost blown up by the end trying to keep out of the way of the flying and being in the right position for her spots. 3½ stars. 3. Rocky Maivia, Dwayne Johnson, beat Ken Shamrock in 10:53 via DQ to retain the IC title. Maivia, who actually spent his childhood living in this area when his father and grandfather were two of the top local babyfaces, controlled most of the match. Since both are relatively inexperienced, there were some sloppy spots such as both going for moves at the same time or hesitations, and the finish was a screw job. I can actually recall when I was in junior high school seeing Dwayne Johnson run around backstage every Wednesday night at the San Jose Civic Auditorium with his mom and sometimes his grandmother. First big spot was Shamrock going for the Hurricane Rana, but being caught at the top and dropped backwards into a hot shot for a near fall. Maivia also did a nice float over DDT, and when he tried a second one, Shamrock made a nice reversal into a suplex. Finish saw ref Mike Chioda distracted by the Nation of Domination, and Maivia clocked Shamrock with brass knucks and put the knucks in Shamrock's tights, but Shamrock kicked out of the pin. Shamrock then delivered a belly-to-belly and got the 3 count. Maivia told Chioda about the knucks in the trunks, and Shamrock went into his trunks and handed them to the ref, who reversed his decision. Shamrock then gave Chioda a belly-to-belly and put him in the ankle lock until the other refs broke it up. Somewhat similar to Shamrock's SummerSlam finish. 2¼ stars. 4. Legion of Doom, Joe Laurinaitis and Michael Hegstrand, beat New Age Outlaws, Monty Sopp and Brian James, via DQ, so the Outlaws retained the WWF tag titles in 7:56. The Outlaws wore Brett Favre Packers jerseys to get heat, which didn't work as much as you'd think. They said that Animal was suffering back spasms that day and was recommended to not wrestle, which set the stage for the match storyline. Most of the match consisted of them working over Animal, which is probably because Hawk wasn't in shape yet. Hawk ended up missing a shoulder block and flew out of the ring, where he was handcuffed to the corner. Animal was worked over for a while, but ended up catching Billy Gunn with a power slam as he came off the top rope, but Jesse James nailed him in the back with a chair as he went for the pin for the DQ. They continued to destroy Animal after the match with chair shots and Gunn coming off the top with a splash on him until Hawk broke the gimmicked handcuffs and hit the ring, clocking both with chairs. The match itself was better than you'd think, but the ending was particularly weak for a pay-per-view show. 1¼ stars. 5. Steve Austin Steve Williams won the 27-man Royal Rumble in 55-24, throwing out Maivia. It opened with Cactus Jack Foley against Chainsaw Charlie Terry Funk. The announcers openly referred to Charlie as Funk, and Funk at one point took the pantyhose off his head so everyone could see him as Funk, but then put them back on. The two basically traded fairly hard chair shots, including one spot where Jack gave Funk a chair to allow Funk to hammer him twice. It didn't get over as well as you think, as ECW has never been on television in this area. Well, there was a brief period when it was on a station that actually nobody gets, but you know what I mean. So the stuff that would have gotten over great in the Northeast didn't mean as much. In some ways, because of nostalgia and who he is, it is great seeing Funk in a major event, but because of his physical limitations and his being reduced to a total comedy garbage style, and this not being Japan, where his legend makes up for it with the crowd and he's respected for just being Terry Funk, it's also sad. Tom Brandi was the next guy in, and at 2:06 Jack and Funk threw him out. So he was this year's Bushwhacker, lasting all of probably 15 seconds. Jack suplexed Funk onto 2 chairs. Maivia came in and they did some garbage can spots on him that got a good crowd reaction. Headbanger Mosh, Charles Warrington, was in next. Funk went for a moonsault on him, and I still don't know if he hit or missed it, as Funk solid it like a miss, and Mosh sold it like he was hit. The announcers called it a miss, and visually it looked like he hit him when he was supposed to miss. Phineas Godwin, Dennis Knight, was in next. 8 Ball, Ron Harris, followed. To show that the crowd live really only knew the top stars and didn't care or know anything else, many people popped when he came out thinking it was Steve Austin. Cactus Jack was eliminated at 9:22, missing a shoulder block on Funk and sailing over the top. Blackjack Bradshaw, John Hawk, was in next. He looked noticeably larger, and since he's just signed a new 4-year contract, Ross was giving him an extra push in the commentary. Owen Hart was supposed to be in next, but Jeff Jarrett and Jim Cornette jumped him on the way in. Cornette gave him several tennis racket shots, and Hart never made it in, at least for a while. Steve Blackman was in next. At this point, Funk was doing all his classic rope tricks of not quite being eliminated. The crowd was totally dead at this point, with the ring filled with guys who weren't over to the live crowd except Maivia, who they had already seen earlier in the show. D'Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, was next, and got a reaction going right after Maivia. Kurgan, Robert Millay, was in next. I figured they'd make him a monster and throw out a bunch of guys, but really all he did was make his cartoon faces. The problem at this point is Kurgan's only gimmick is his height and his unique cartoon character face, but with guys like Maivia, 8 Ball, Phineas, and Bradshaw in there who are all deceptively huge and tall, but can't get over because when so many guys are 6'5" to 6'7", a 6'6" guy is no longer tall. His size didn't even stand out in the ring, although they tried to play his size up in the commentary for all it was worth, because it is all he's worth. Kurgan threw out Mosh at 18:44. Mark Marrow came out with the cartoon character known as Sable next. At 2017, Kurgan threw out Blackman. Ken Shamrock was in next. They tried to create an Austin storyline, as Jerry Lawler claimed to have info in the back that Shamrock had beaten up Austin and Austin wouldn't be able to come out. They built to a spot where Shamrock knocked Kurgan off his feet for the first time. At 21:47, half the guys in the ring got rid of Kurgan. Headbanger Thrasher, Glenn Ruth, was in next. Phineas Godwin was looking some kind of horrible, throwing the lamest blows at this point. Mick Foley then came out in his Mankind gimmick, gaining revenge, throwing out Charlie Funk in 25:22. The Ofka Goldust came in and dumped Mankind in 27:50, giving his time for his next costume change. Jeff Jarrett was next in, but surprise, Owen Hart had recovered and was right there behind him. Jarrett didn't last long, as Hart dumped him at 30:07. Honky Tonk Man, Roy Wayne Ferris, was next in, followed by Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Chyna. At 30:47, Maivia gave Shamrock a low blow and dumped him. Chyna went to hit Hart with a crutch, but Hart blocked it, but it allowed Helmsley to clock him, knowing him out of the ring at 31:14. Ahmed Johnson, Tony Norris, was next in, and he stunk up the joint, although no worse than Mark Henry, who followed. Henry looked totally lost. Since Henry at this point was working with Johnson, who may have gotten out of the doghouse with his attitude in camp but seems to have actually gotten worse in the ring, their stuff was hideous. And since they were the focal point of this part of the match, phew. Then nobody came out, which they teased was supposed to be Austin trying to give you the impression that he wasn't going to even be in the match. Yeah, sure. The next night they claimed this position was supposed to be Skull and gave a lame injury excuse as to why he wasn't there. Henry and Brown mercifully threw out Johnson at 36:03. Then came the only apparent injury, as Henry threw out Phineas, who landed right on the head of ref Jack Doan on the floor at 36:13. Doan legitimately had to be rushed out of the building in an ambulance, and the preliminary report was that he had suffered a concussion. Kama Mustafa, former local high school basketball star Charles Wright, was in next. Steve Austin was in next and threw out Marrow in 39:34 and threw out 8 Ball at 39:46. At this point, Ross said how Mike Tyson could identify with Steve Austin. This glorifying that sociopathic rapist and ignoring every single thing he's most well known for in the commentary and visuals, even though this is all fun and games and we all know what the score is, just doesn't sit well and came off as really tasteless. Then again, it isn't as if wrestling promoters of the past haven't used their television to glorify and change the public's opinion of accused murderers and rapists, although unlike Tyson, no convicted murderers or rapists that I'm aware of, in the recent past either. Judging from the crowd reaction whenever they showed his face, I'm not alone in that thinking. Henry Godwin, Mark Canterbury, was next in. This segment was most noted for the most pathetic hip toss in pay-per-view history, Mark Henry on Oscar Goldust. Henry appeared to hurt his knee at this point although kept going on. Savio Vega, Juan Rivera, was next in, joined by his fellow Boricua buddies. Austin then threw Jesus, Miguel and Jose out the middle ropes and they all departed. Farouk, Ron Simmons, was in next, and attacked all his fellow Nation of Domination members. Dude Love followed, and got an initial pop for his music, but it died almost immediately. Based on crowd reactions, it appeared the match had dragged on too long by this point as the crowd was mostly dead even with Austin in the ring. Dude eliminated Bradshaw at 46-41. Chains' Brian Harris was in next. At 48-36, Farouk backdropped Brown out. With the match itself at the 48-minute mark, Ross exclaimed how Maivia had been in the ring for well over 50 minutes. Vader was the last man in. At 50-31, Vader dumped Honky. Crowd was still dead waiting for the climax. It became the Titanic everyone jumps overboard finish, as Austin dumped Thrasher at 51-30, Austin dumped Kama at 51-36, Austin dumped Vega at 52-21, Goldust dumped Vader at 52-30, Henry Godwin missed a charge at Dude it dumped himself at 52-40, Chains dumped Goldust at 52-51, Austin dumped Chains at 53-20 and in the funniest of all, Mark Henry kind of left at 53-24. Farouk was supposed to be boot him out of the ring. He didn't go over and Farouk, not realizing he didn't leave, just walked away figuring the spot was over, rather than giving him another move to eliminate him. Henry stood there confused not knowing what to do, which at this point you could hardly blame him for, and sheepishly jumped out of the ring. This left Dude and Austin versus Rocky and Farouk. Dude put the claw on Austin, who broke it with a low blow. At 54-29, Farouk kicked Dude out. Maivia just sat in the corner while Farouk and Austin went at it, and seeing his chance to eliminate both, charged. Of course he screwed up, only eliminating Farouk in 54-53. Seeing just Austin against Maivia, it was like the dead crowd was suddenly supercharged with energy. Unfortunately, it only lasted 31 seconds more before Austin gave Maivia the stunner and threw him over the top. 2.5 stars. 6. Shawn Michaels, Michael Hickenbottom, beat Undertaker, Mark Calloway, 2037 of a casket match to retain the WWF title. Real good work by both, Michaels in particular. Michaels took one incredible bump early, taking a backdrop over the top rope and cracking his lower back on the casket as he went over. He was really lucky he wasn't hurt on that one. Undertaker pressed him overhead and dropped him on the floor. Michaels was thrown into the casket but quickly ran out. Michaels took a Harley race bump over the top to the floor. Michaels was thrown into the casket again. As Undertaker went to shut the lid, Michaels threw white powder into his eyes. This spot was stupid for drama because in the Rumble for almost no reason, Henry threw powder in Johnson's eyes and Johnson only sold it momentarily, and quite frankly Undertaker really only sold this spot momentarily as well. Michaels hit a nice moonsault block. Outside the ring, Undertaker did the spot where he was whipped into the ring steps and took it on his knees hard. Michaels began dropping the steps on Undertaker's back and gave him a piledriver on the steps, making a clanging noise. Helmsley then attacked Undertaker with a few crutch and chair shots. Undertaker was thrown in the casket and pounded his way out, punching Triple H in the process. Michaels used a swinging neckbreaker and a sleeper, but Undertaker got out of it with a back suplex. Michaels came back dropping an elbow off the top. Ross made a references to nobody in the industry doing the move like that, as a basic knock on Randy Savage. Earlier in the show he made a remark obviously directed at WCW headliners saying that the WWF is for athletes in their primes and it isn't the seniors tour. Michaels hit the super kick and tried to put Undertaker in the casket, but before he could slam the door, Undertaker used the claw to the groin and got out. Michaels then took a Ray Stevens flip bump into the corner and was nailed by a foot to the face. Undertaker went for a crossbody, but missed and fell into the casket. Michaels came off the top rope with an elbow drop into the casket and the lid closed on both of them. It opened and both staggered out. Undertaker used an impressive-looking one-arm choke slam, and followed by tombstoning Michaels from the apron into the casket. At this point Chyna knocked down the ref and Los Boricuas and the New Age Outlaws hit the ring and all began attacking Undertaker. Kane's music played and he cleaned house. An explosion was supposed to go off to set the stage for his turning on Taker, but there was a screw-up on the spot. But Kane turned on him and punched and kicked him a few times before choke slamming him into the casket, and Michaels shut the lid for the victory. After all the punishment both had survived, Kane's offense should have been more brutal, at least delivering a tombstone. When it came to finishing Undertaker off, Paul Bearer, who had been kept off the road for a few weeks to build drama for his return, prompting a million ridiculous rumors, came out and locked the casket. Kane took an axe and started chopping away, then poured gasoline all over it and Paul Bearer lit it on fire as the show went off the air. The match itself was really good, but it was taken down by the finish. 3.5 stars. Weekly Pro Wrestling magazine in its January 20th issue did its annual attendance rundown for 1997. According to magazine figures, which in a sense shouldn't be taken seriously since virtually all the smaller groups exaggerate their attendance as something fierce, there were 42 major promotions that operated in Japan last year, totaling 1,437 house shows and drawing a total of 2,796,321 fans. The total audience as far as announced attendance went had topped 3 million the past several years, so this would be the lowest when it comes to announced attendance in recent memory. Of companies where we can take the attendance figures as something approximating accurate, New Japan drew 710,272 fans in 135 house shows, 5,261 fans per show. All Japan drew 426,650 in 135 house shows, 3,160 per show. Rings drew 64,470 on 13 shows, 4,959 per show. Michinoku Pro drew 70,449 on 126 shows, 559 per show, and Pancrase drew 44,900 on 14 shows, 3,207 per. The financially beleaguered All Japan Women's promotion still ran almost double the amount of shows of any company in Japan in 1997, running 268 house shows. Other companies running more than 100 shows last year were FMW 118 and JWP 115. Japanese television rundown. January 4th, New Japan. 1. Shinjiro Otani pinned Ultimo Dragon in 1706 to retain the IWGP Junior title. A domed stadium is the worst place to work a match of this style, but this turned into an excellent match largely built around a series of reversals of La Magistral, Dragon's hot finishing cradle. They used all kinds of big moves and near falls, peaking when Dragon got near falls, finally getting La Magistral, and another with his spinning Hurricane Rana off the top rope. Finish saw Dragon once again go for La Magistral, but this time Otani quickly reversed the move into a German suplex, and then hit the Dragon suplex for the finish. Only the second half of the match aired on television, but it was easily the best match based on what aired on the show. 4.25 stars. 2. Riki Choshu had his final 5 matches of his career. This whole deal was a dud, as Choshu didn't take any bumps for his foes, who mainly punched and kicked him for about a minute or two before Choshu came back with one lariat and/or scorpion for the win. The best part of the whole deal was actually seeing Choshu almost in tears backstage just as he was about to go on, and the monstrous crowd reaction for a teary-eyed Choshu just as his trademark entrance music Power Hall began playing. Since Choshu has had the same entrance music for close to 20 years, the last 15 of which he's been a headliner working in both major promotions, the Power Hall theme for Choshu is probably one of the 2 or 3 most immediately recognizable entrance music pieces for any wrestler in history. Kazuyuki Fujita, who has looked good in his previous TV matches, had no chance to show anything. Yutaka Yoshi, who is built along the lines of a younger Shinya Hashimoto, fat, seemed to move like a good athlete but also showed nothing. Tatsuhiro Takaiwa, who is a good worker, showed nothing. Takashi Iizuka beat Choshu with a cool finisher, reversing the scorpion into an Achilles heel hook, although the finish was the only thing good about the match. Jushin Liger tried in his match, but Choshu had nothing left, although he did do a rather sloppy pescado known in Japan as a plancha, before winning after 2 lariats. The crowd pop was thunderous when he came out, but the whole building recognized after his winning just how disappointing the whole 5-match deal was. It was like the guy wrestled 1 show too many before he was done. Dud. 3. Don Frye beat Naoya Ogawa in 8:47 using the choke after a low blow. These two worked out a pretty decent match in Minnesota. Ogawa looked much better than he had in recent matches, and threw some really great judo takedowns that Fry sold well. Fry took good bumps, but the match still fell within the realm of realistic, which it needed to be. Both guys really didn't know how to sell, but in a match like this, if they sold like pro wrestlers, it would ruin the aura to begin with. 2 stars. 4. Shinya Hashimoto beat Dennis Lane in 135 when he tackled him and Lane legitimately broke his kneecap and motioned for the match to end. The crowd booed this heavily. -1 star. 5. Masahiro Chono pinned Shiro Koshinaka in 1505. Chono had a great ring entrance with the 2 baseball stars along with Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito coming out with him, and the crowd popped big for the group. It built into a good match with him trading big moves and getting some near falls. After delivering 2 power bombs, Koshinaka really screwed up a third one, which was the one bad part of the match. They had some nice transitions into their hot moves, ending when Chono hit the Yakuza kick for the fall. 3 stars. 6. Kensuke Sasaki retained the IWGP Heavyweight belt, beating Keiji Muto in 25-18. Muto carried the match and worked a slow pace since they were going so long. Technically, Muto was very good when it came to moves and psychology, but he worked so slow and lacked aggressiveness, which made the middle part of the match lacking in excitement. Muto did all his regular signature spots until being cut off by Sasaki hitting 2 reverse ipponzes, the first rather sloppy. Sasaki got his power strangle on, but Muto got out and began working the knee. He did a great job and the match got good from this point on, using dragon screws drop kicks to the knee one after another, including off the middle ropes until putting on the figure 4, which the crowd saw as the finish. Sasaki made the ropes. Muto put it on in the middle and held the hold for a while until Sasaki made a rope break. Muto used a moonsault, but Sasaki kicked out. After a drop kick off the top, Muto went for a Frankensteiner off the top, but Sasaki caught him in midair and dropped him down into a power bomb. Sasaki tried a Northern Lights bomb, but his knee gave out. It was a false tease, and he then gutted it out and tried the move and executed it for a near fall, then did it again and got the pin. 3.5 stars. Mexico. Promo Azteca is scheduled to get a regular time slot on Channel 7 in Mexico City, TV Azteca, at 11:30 a.m. every Saturday. The show has been bounced around the weekend and has often aired past midnight. Pepe Aguayo is scheduled to start with Azteca on January 30th, and Lizmark Sr. should start about a week later. Headhunters are scheduled to return in March, but Steel Sean Morley won't be coming in for a feud with La Parca, as WWF, which signed Morley this past week, didn't want him returning to Mexico. They tried to test out doing an all-Japan-style one-fall main event on January 16th with La Parca and Tinieblas Jr. and Lizmark Jr. and Zorro versus Vampiro Canadiense and Black Magic, Norman Smiley, and Dandy and Silver King. Apparently the fans didn't go for the idea of Vampiro working on the heel side. In EMLL, Mr. Niebla and Shocker are getting the big babyface push in a headline feud against Dr. Wagner Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. Phantasma, who is a possibility to head the Wrestling Commission, is back in EMLL on top, perhaps to build to a masked feud that he would lose, since if he goes to the commission, he'll have to give up being an active wrestler and obviously would have to give up his mask. The Azteca wrestlers, Pierre Roth Jr., Jerry Estrada, Villano III and El Texano, that were in Puerto Rico were all deported for not having proper working papers. There was a lot of heat among those 4 about it, to the point things could have gotten nasty if they knew who did it. Lady Apache and La Diabolica look to be jumping from EMLL to Azteca. Apache is generally considered as by far the best of the weak lot of Mexican women wrestlers. Add another one to the list of lawsuits out there. Antonio Pena sued Conan for defamation of character. The next major show in Tijuana will be January 30th. There is a new mini wrestler for EMLL using the ring name Mini Satoru Sayama, which gave TV announcer Dr. Alfonso Morales a chance to give the story of Satoru Sayama, the original Tiger Mask, when he became a superstar in Mexico in the late 70s before ever taking on the Tiger Mask gimmick that made him legendary. Expect these programs to be pushed in Azteca in 1998. Venom Black vs. Super Crazy, Mr. Aguila vs. Mosco de la Merced, Oro Jr. vs. Jurassico, Super Muñeco vs. Damien 666 and Tinieblas Jr. vs. Black Magic. All Japan. Giant Baba announced his 60th birthday card on January 23rd, which is the date of his 60th birthday, and he's still in the ring doing whatever it is he does every night. at Korakuen Hall with a special headliner of Baba and Mitsuharu Misawa and Manukia Mossman vs Kena Kobashi and Toshiaki Kawada and Masa Fuchi. Baba announced the main event after the completion of the round-robin phase of the Asunaro Cup tournament, which ended on January 19. Since the Cup championship would be on the same show, the Cup final will be Jun Akiyama and Takawa Mori vs Akira Taue and Kentaro Shiga. Since Akiyama basically said earlier in the tour that this tournament would be his final time teaming with Mori, they'd be the favorites to win, beating Shiga, since Shiga is still basically an underneath guy. Akiyama and Mori beat Johnny Smith and Manukia Mossman to finish round robin with a 4-1-1 record. Taue and Shiga were 4-2, Kawada and Masao Inoue, Misawa and Satoru Asako and Smith and Mossman were all 3-3, while Tamon Honda and Jun Izumida were 2-3-1 and Kena Kobashi and Yoshinobu Kanemaru finished 1-5. Steve Williams is out of action with a back injury but should be back on January 23. If you understand All Japan Wrestling, you'll understand it must be a serious injury because wrestlers simply don't miss matches with that promotion unless they're near death. Taue nearly missed the January 15th show due to a massive snowstorm. Because all the highways were closed and the chains on his car tires broke, he actually had to drive 10 hours to make it to the show and got there about 10 minutes before the main event match that he was scheduled in was to start. Usually the All Japan wrestlers travel on a tour bus, but he must have missed connections or something. He changed quickly, did his match, and then immediately went back for the long drive home. The first major shows of 1998 are January 25th in Yokohama and January 26th in Osaka, the latter date headlined by Misawa vs Akiyama for the Triple Crown, and ends the tour. The next tour will be February 14th to February 28th, with the final night being the first Budokan Hall show. While the first actual negotiations between WWF and All Japan directly start this week, there is already media speculation that the top matches involving WWF talent would be Undertaker vs Taue, which would probably stink, and Kobashi vs Vader, which should be very good, underneath a Misawa vs Kawada Triple Crown match on top. Politically, if that's what All Japan wants, it should be an easy negotiation, as they can trade an Undertaker win for a Vader loss and WWF would have no problem with it. Gary Albright will be marrying the daughter of a Samoan in Maui soon. January 4th TV show did a 3.2 rating. New Japan no shows as the new tour begins on January 26th. The January 4th television show, which was the Tokyo Dome special built around the farewell to Riki Choshu, did an incredible 8.1 rating, airing from 11:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. on a Sunday night, which has to be something like a 70 share. That is by far the most impressive television rating for a pro wrestling show in many years. New Japan has drawn bigger numbers in the past when it has gotten a prime time slot, but this was late Sunday night in a country where few people are watching television at that hour because they start work early on Mondays. Most of the news revolves around the various contracts being signed for 1998. It was announced that Kensuke Sasaki, Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Yutaka Yoshi, Kazuyuki Fujita and Shinya Makabe all signed their new contracts on January 19th, and that Shinjiro Otani signed on January 20th. It is believed that Sasaki and Otani got big raises. They are doing an angle since they are publicizing that Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono come in for negotiations this week, with Chono publicly saying he won't sign unless they give him a huge raise. Muto and Chono will be getting a lot of national publicity as they filmed 2 television commercials for Toyo Suisan Maruchan, 3-minute noodles, that begin playing on February 2nd, and will have a huge promotional push put behind it. As we had figured months ago, the retirement of Riki Choshu was also a political deal to set an example and allow the company to start cleaning house of some of the older wrestlers. It has been reported in Japan that Tatsumi Fujinami, 44, Junji Hirata, 41, Masa Saito, 55, Osamu Kido, 47, and Kengo Kimura, 44, were all given an offer that if they agreed to retire this year, they'll be paid their entire salary in full for the next 3 years. Saito, who for all real purposes has retired and is working in the front office as television color commentator, and from reports we get does a great job in that role, will probably have a major retirement ceremony within the next few months. Other Japan notes. DirecTV of Japan will broadcast the first women's wrestling pay-per-view in that country on February 18th at Korakuen Hall, which will be the debut of Asia Concert promotion at a cost of 1,800 yen, $15. Candy Akutsu, who retired from JWP just a few months back, was at a press conference for Urshan on January 16th, which was also her 23rd birthday, where this announcement was made. and said she had just started training a few days earlier for her comeback on that show. Although ECW just did an angle on January 10th where Great Sasuke suffered the knee injury that will require major surgery, Sasuke has needed the surgery for some time but kept putting it off since he's his company's biggest drawing card and his company is in financial peril, as a way to make Just Incredible both more of a star in ECW and also a name for Japan. Sasuke went and did the same basic angle on January 16th in Sapporo where Dick Togo and Shoichi Funaki injured his knee and hospitalized him. MPW's biggest card since the Sumo Hall show drew 5,326 fans with Super Delphin capturing the UWF Super Welterweight title from men's Teo in the main event. After the show, Delphin said that he wanted to keep the promotion going while Sasuke was out of action. As expected, Genichiro Tenryu captured the J1 Rikidozan belt title beating Nobutaka Arai in the tournament final on January 14th at Korakuen Hall. Tenryu has talked of defending the title against wrestlers from other promotions and there has already been talk of his facing Naoya Ogawa for the belt at the April 4th Tokyo Dome. Pancrase ran January 16th at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,250 to see the return of Minoru Suzuki. Suzuki, who has been out of action with injuries for the most part for the past year plus and appears prone to knockouts because he's been knocked out so many times, lost in the main event to Semishil via knockout in 9:52 from a knee to the head. In the other top matches, Ryushi Yanagisawa knocked out Jason Godsey to keep his number 6 ranking. Asami Shibuya kept his number 8 ranking beating Keiichiro Yamamiya with an ankle lock submission and Jason DeLucia beat Takafumi Ito 1-0 by points after their match went all 10 minutes. The next show is February 6th in Yokohama. The gimmick is that the Yokohama Dojo, Yanagisawa, Katsumi Inagaki, Shibuya, Ito and Yuki Kondo will send 5 guys in the Tokyo Dojo, Masakatsu Funaki, Hakaku Fuke, Yoshiki Takahashi, Kyuma Kunyoku and Yamamiya will send 5 guys and they'll have 5 singles matches and draw straws as to who they wrestle in the ring at the beginning for the show. Jado and Yukihiro Kanemura and Mr. Ganasu captured FMW's World 6-Man Street Fight Tag Team title beating Hisakatsu Oya and Masato Tanaka and Hayabusa on January 16th in Yokkaichi. Chigusa Nagio of Gia will be undergoing knee surgery in February. Takashi Ishikawa opened up his new Tokyo Pro Wrestling promotion on January 18th at Korakuen Hall. Ishikawa had built up the card first as having a career versus career retirement match with him against Bad News Allen as the main event, then later announced that he had decided to retire and this would be his final match. But it was just an angle as at the show. Ishikawa said that he had changed his mind and would continue to wrestle at least through the summer. His show featured 2 names from the not too distant past coming out of retirement. 52-year-old former kickboxer Katsuji Ueda, who lost a supposed kickboxing match to George Takano, who also rarely wrestles after being a big star in the 80s, and former sumo wrestler Koji Ishimiki. Ueda did really bad worked martial arts matches in the early days of the FMW, as apparently he was something of a personal bodyguard for Atsushi Onita. At a show in Kawasaki, Ryuji Yamakawa was thrown off the balcony from Shadow WX and Shadow Winger. Doug Gilbert won a battle royal on January 13th at Tokyo Korakuen Hall to capture the vacant IWA title. The belt was hung from the ceiling and whomever climbed a ladder and pulled the belt down became the champion. In one of the fastest pinfalls in Japanese history on January 14th at the Michinoku show in Sendai, Jinsei Shinzaki pinned Magic Man in 5.49 seconds. Tank Abbott won't be making his pro wrestling debut on the January 28th Kingdom show in Tokyo. Valley Tudo star Valid Ismail cancelled for the second time appearing, this time claiming his father was in poor health, so the main event will be Hiromitsu Kanehara vs. Rick Lucero, said to be a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu star, and Kazushi Sakuraba in his first post-UFC match against Larry Parker. Here and there. A lot of craziness in the Portland, Oregon area revolving around former Portland wrestling booker Matt Bourne. On December 12th, promoter Jeff Kafori had a meeting with Bruce Anderson, who heads the Wrestling Commission, the only commission in the country that actually really does regulate pro wrestling, which is why WWF has stayed out of the state for years and why WCW had, although they are going in for a Nitro in Portland in July, and a police captain. According to the newsletter Ring Around the Northwest, Kafori was saying Booker Bourne was out of control, between spraying the contents of a fire extinguisher in the crowd and too frequent hardway juicing. Blading is illegal in Oregon. There were also reports of cocaine usage in the dressing room. Osborne then did his radio show on December 13th and attacked Anderson, claiming he lied under oath in a civil hearing where wrestler Ed Giovanetti, Moondog Moretti, was suing then promoter Ron Barber when Barber actually marked out during an angle and hit the ring and clocked him many years ago. Osborne, who testified in the case, which Giovanetti won, said that Giovanetti really wasn't hurt in the incident and claimed he was basically extorting money from Barber. On December 20th, Osborne wasn't there for the radio show and the station ran a retraction apologizing to Giovanetti and Anderson for Osborne's remarks. At that point, Osborne was still booking but off the radio, as the radio show was going on with others involved in the company hosting it, and they were promoting the wrestling show for that night. Osborne and Ivan Kafoury were apparently talking on the phone, and according to the story, Osborne asked Kafoury for $200 for the use of his ring for the show. Kafoury refused and then went right on the radio and announced the house show that night that they had been advertising was being cancelled, and at that point severed all relations with Osborne. The Kafourys were back in business on December 27th using a different ring and using Buddy Wayne, Steve Finley, who has since become the head booker, Bart Sawyer, Steve Stewart, and former wrestler Tito Carreon as a booking committee. It would be the final show in Portland for several weeks because they need to find a new location, as the building they were using was being lost when the City Department of Buildings decided the industrial area wasn't zoned for pro wrestling events. The commission showed up and drug tested all the wrestlers, and it has since come out in the local newspaper that Sumito, James Sudonu, tested positive for marijuana and would be suspended 30 to 60 days, and that Sawyer tested positive for cocaine and marijuana and would be suspended up to 6 months. Carreon, who wasn't licensed, was asked to leave the backstage area. Rumor has it that Osborne and Barber will join forces and try to promote across the state border in Vancouver, Washington, and that former promoter Sandy Barr, who lost his license due to not complying with commission bylaws, will try and get back in the fray. Dennis Corraluzzo will be doing an Eddie Gilbert tribute show which will also be honoring several other wrestlers, among them Dory Funk Sr. and Nick Bockwinkel, on February 27th and February 28th at the Philadelphia Airport Radisson Hotel. There will be a dinner on February 27th, a condo at midnight on February 27th, a wrestling convention on the afternoon of February 28th, and a wrestling show that evening. The main event of the wrestling show will be the return of Sid. No, he's not going back to the WWF at the next pay-per-view, Vicious vs. King Kong Bundy. Plus, also appearing for the weekend will be Ricky Morton, Robert Gibson, Doug Gilbert, Dory Funk Jr., Jim Cornette, and Sonny. A group called St. Paul Championship Wrestling drew 700 on January 17th in West St. Paul with Jim Brunzel, said to have looked real good for a 48-year-old, beating the hater on top. The bigger names on the show weren't in the ring but in the corners: Ken Patera, Nick Bockwinkel, and Sheik Adnan El-Khazi. One Man Gang and Charlie Norris appear for Eddie Sharkey on February 6th in St. Paul. Doug Gilbert brought his IWA belt from Japan to Music City Wrestling and retained it, beating Billy Travis on January 17th in Nashville before 400 fans. From our reports, Wolfie D and Flash Flanagan are having one of the most underrated feuds in the U.S. on top for this group. Century Wrestling Alliance drew a sellout 1,100 for a television taping on January 17th in Southbridge, Massachusetts. Next show is January 24th in Ridgefield, Connecticut at the high school with Tito Santana, King Kong Bundy, Abdullah the Butcher, Tony Atlas, and an appearance by Killer Kowalski. IWW runs February 15th in Hanover, Germany with Dirt Bike Kid vs. Mikey Whipwreck and Sabu, and Rob Van Dam vs. Ulf Herman and Franz Schumann as the main events. For more info you can call 01149-511-690-555, and if you bring a copy of the Observer to the card you'll get 1 mark off the ticket price. Impact Wrestling Federation debuts January 31st in Simi Valley, California at the Impact Zone. RF Video at P.O. Box 797, Langhorne, Pennsylvania will be producing a Brian Pillman video with proceeds going to the Pillman family. They also had just released a video of a Rob Van Dam interview at their offices talking about his career from its inception. John Harrington is now running weekly Saturday night shows in Georgetown, Tennessee. The shows have been drawing around 200 per show using Recon of the Truth Commission, Bulldog Reigns, Terry Gordy as the top face, although he still works like he's totally in a daze, and Mike Golden. Wrestling Trivia Department. 2 of the most powerful figures in the pro wrestling industry during the 60s and early 70s were both classmates and on the wrestling team at Hammond, in high school in the 1930s. Answer: Dory Funk Sr., who was the top star and also the promoter, a combination that happened all the time in those days, in West Texas, and Roy Shire, who was the promoter in Northern California, which during that period was considered one of the hotbeds of pro wrestling. As far as the odds of that happening, probably not all that different than the odds of Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada also being on the same high school wrestling team, and that in high school, Kawada and Jushin Liger, who were in the same weight class, wrestled one another in the high school nationals, which I believe was in the national finals, and Kawada won. NHB. The Kakutogi Revolution Spirits, KRS, promotion held a press conference on January 16 and announced Mark Kerr, 7-0 NHB, versus Bronco Sikatic, the very first K1 champion in 1993, although he's now 42 or 43 years old, as the main event for Pride 2 on March 15 at the Yokohama Arena. Even though Sikatic has a name from K1, this match has very little if any box office appeal to the Japanese fans. Gary Goodridge versus Marco Ruiz will be the semi-main on the show. Royce Gracie came to Japan for the press conference and explained about his back injury and that he would be out of action until June, and said that he would like to fight Kerr at that point. Kerr's legal situation is back up in the air. The New York judge who originally ruled against Semaphore Entertainment Group in their attempt to get an injunction to prevent Kerr from fighting for KRS due to his UFC contract, agreed upon appeal that he may have been mistaken and misinterpreted New York law as it applies to UFC in his original ruling. The judge ordered the case reopened for this coming week and ordered Kerr to appear in court for a deposition. Kerr reportedly has already received a $50,000 advance from KRS for his proposed fight with Gracie that fell through, which is why they are using him in the main event on the next show, because the money is already spent, even though he doesn't have an opponent he can draw against. The original ruling puts all existing UFC contracts into question, which is likely the reason the judge is re-evaluating the original ruling. Cable World enlisting the top 10 news stories in that industry for 1997, listed the dropping of NHB by so many cable companies as the number 8 story of the year. Dennis Hall, who captured a silver medal in Greco-Roman wrestling in the 1996 Olympics and was a world Greco champion in 1995, made his NHB debut on January 17 at Tokyo Korakuen Hall for the Shudo promotion, losing in the main event to Shudo's lightweight champion, Noboru Asahi, in 4:18 of the second round to an armbar submission. Shudo is very similar to UFC now that UFC has adopted its new rules, with the only differences being they fight in a ring instead of an octagon. Hall had lost a submissions-only match to Joao Roque by decision on the IWF pay-per-view show in October. After the show, Rico Chiapparelli, Raw, Real American Wrestlers, team coach, said that he felt overall the fighters from Shudo were the most complete fighters in the world. Shudo's top star, Rumina Sato, who has the tag in some circles right now as the best pound-for-pound fighter in NHB, won't be in the March 13 UFC show, as he has already agreed to do a Shudo show on March 1 and a combat wrestling, yet another Japanese sport which is basically submission wrestling but with more points awarded for aggressiveness and for pinning as compared with IWF, card on March 15. Fabio Gurgel of Brazil is considering doing the UFC. It would appear that Jason Godsey of Pancrase, who was being strongly considered for a match with Maurice Smith on that show, will have to be pulled since UFC rules don't allow anyone to compete who has been knocked out in competition within the previous 90 days, and Godsey was knocked out by Ryushi Yanagisawa on the January 16 Pancrase show. Guy Mesger ran his second World Pancratian Championships on January 17 at the Bronco Bowl in Dallas, Texas, before 2,200 fans, which is fighting under Pancrase rules. The top matches consisted of Pancrase and/or UFC fighters against inexperienced unknowns, with the Pancrase/NHB fighters, Brian Gassaway, Leslie Gassaway, Jerry Bolander, Pete Williams, Mesger, and Trey Telligman, all winning, in most cases easily. In a match with two former Pancrase fighters against each other, Alex Andrade beat Paul Lesenby in 13 minutes after getting 3 rope escapes. Angel Orsini, who lost a shoot match in Japan to Yumiko Hata a few years ago, lost to Kathy Brothers in a bout that apparently got the most crowd reaction. The most serious injury was to Scott McMullen, who needed 20 stitches to close a head cut that was bleeding badly in a match against Williams. The Texas State Athletic Commission was at the show and was very supportive of the sport. Dan Severn was scheduled for a NHB match against former kickboxer Kevin Rozier, 1-2 UFC record, on a February 27 show in Muncie, Indiana, promoted by Monty Cox. No word on how his WWF contract will affect that booking. Matt Hume did an internet interview and when asked about his record, gave his NHB record and then brought up Pancrase, and you can't consider his Pancrase record because some of the matches were worked. ECW. The March 1 pay-per-view show has been moved and should be finalized before you read this as being in Asbury Park, New Jersey, with a 7 p.m. starting time. Stevie Richards' neck is healing faster than expected, but he also has vocal cord damage which may require additional surgery. House shows this weekend were January 16 in Rostraver, Pennsylvania and January 17 in Monaca, Pennsylvania, drawing about 1,700 and 2,300 respectively. In Rostraver, rookie Danny Morrison was given the new ring name of Danny During. The deal is he's going to work openers and intentionally work boring matches to elicit chants of boring, which since it rhymes with during, he'll take his babyface chance for him. During Paul Diamond, Ballet Chastity and Roadkill look to be put together as a prelim heel group. They also used newcomers in the top 2 matches on the show as Sabu beat Adam Flash in what was said to have been a bad match, and Rob Van Dam beat Mike Anthony, who has wrestled as Tigra Canadiense in Mexico, along with Canadian Tiger and Mike Lazansky around the world. Anthony tore his thigh muscle in the first move of the match and stayed in there for 10 minutes but was working on one leg, so it was horrible. Apparently Sandman is really banged up, as the first night he only worked in the Battle Royal and was eliminated in 1 minute, and on the second night where he was scheduled in the main event, Sabu and Van Dam versus Tommy Dreamer and Sandman, he was jumped by Sabu before the match, deuced heavily and was taken out of there and eventually replaced by Al Snow, who teamed with Dreamer to win the match. Snow's ring entrance with a head gimmick was over huge both nights, although he wasn't as overworking in the main event match. The TV this week where they gave away mannequin heads to bob up and down as Snow came out for his ring entrance and match was even more impressive visually than it sounds. Ross Draver was said to have been an average ECW show overall with a really hot crowd. Justin Credible did an angle in Manaka, the first show back in the building since the pay-per-view, where he injured Jerry Lynn's leg, trying to make him into a crippler gimmick. Neither Brackus nor Nicole Bass were at the shows this weekend. There is apparently already a lot of question as to Bass' potential, as she's reportedly not showing any improvement in the school. Bass won the 1997 NBC Women's Heavyweight and Overall Bodybuilding Championship, and taking one look at her will tell you why that sport is in such sick shape when that is what the judges are looking for in a winner, which is the top amateur contest in the country. It is thought by those within the bodybuilding world with that title and her freakish size that she applied herself, could earn $1,500 to $2,000 per week after expenses doing guest posing at bodybuilding shows, which is a lot more than she'd make as a pro wrestler or valet most likely. Paul Heyman put up a memo at the weekend matches encouraging all wrestlers to train in the ring from 4 to 5 p.m. before the shows. A lot of the guys before the shows would watch sports like football, and Heyman said that if they admire those athletes, they didn't get where they are without a lot of training, and said in 1998 raises would be based on improving work rate in the ring. He also said that the wrestlers need to leave the building's backstage area cleaner, although nobody paid much attention to that request. Shane Douglas did a total babyface interview that'll likely only air in its complete form on the TV in Pittsburgh, where he claimed the doctors had told him to retire and teased he was going to listen until climaxing by saying that he's coming back to a big pop. Doug Furness and Phil LaFawn then tried to attack him, but Chris Condito and Lance Storm made the save, and the segment ended up with Francine giving Lance Wright a belly-to-belly suplex. Shades of Baby Doll and Jim Cornette about 10 years back also in Manaka. Taz challenged Bigelow to apparently set up their program. WCW. Hulk Hogan has not signed his new contract, which we've been led to believe would be for 3 years, nor do I expect he will sign anytime soon, as being a free agent at this point gives him some major leverage. He could leave, although I don't think there's much to the idea of his leaving right now. WWF sources vehemently deny there have even been preliminary talks with him, and WCW sources insist he's going nowhere. His not signing still leaves questions unanswered. Randy Savage is under contract through the end of 1998, so there's nothing to those rumors at all. The Giant's contract expires in March, and WWF is very interested in him, and his name did come up behind the scenes at WWF over the weekend, more as something hoped for as opposed to something expected. Nitro on January 19th at the Superdome in New Orleans drew the second largest crowd in company history, 20,644, announced on television as Shivani's weekly Monsunian attendance figures as more than 25,000, trailing the January 5th Georgia Dome record, which is now being exaggerated to 33,000 and no doubt will be 50,000 someday, with 18,201 paying $354,635 and another $135,469 in merchandise. It was a pretty hot show with good matches underneath and good interviews, and some pretty hideous top matches with names. Rick Martel beat Eddie Guerrero in 3/16 of a fast-paced good match with the Crab. What year is this? Eric Bischoff and Hogan came out for an interview, and Bischoff had Sting's bat, and gave it to Hogan, who said the NWO had a pecking order and he was the boss, to tease more dissension. Right now the feeling seems to be that they'll use his NWO dissension for ratings but aren't going to shoot the big angle yet, although everything is done on the fly and anything can change depending upon the shifts in the ratings. Chris Benoit beat Marty Jannetty in 4:09 with the crossface. Jannetty seemed a step slow, but after the match when Raven's Nest interfered, and Jannetty helped Benoit in running them off, the post-match was really hot with Jannetty doing a pescado on Scotty Riggs and Benoit destroying Lodi with a headbutt off the top. Ernest Miller beat Jerry Flynn with a kick off the top rope in 3:21. Lightning Foot, Flynn's nickname, didn't strike twice as this was awful and fans didn't buy it either. Scott Hall came out for an interview and said that when Larry Zbyszko was AWA champion, it was because his father-in-law owned the company and that the company then went out of business, and then said that Dusty Rhodes was a better wrestler than Zbyszko was. Well, he was a bigger star. As for who was the better wrestler, that argument would be as silly as arguing over who is more honest between Inoki, Hogan, and Vince. Steiner's beat Conan and Marcus Bagwell. Actually, Scott worked the whole match, they played up the dissension big, and pinned Conan with the SSD in 5:27 of a good match. After the match, Ted DiBiase yelled at Scott for never tagging out and he walked away from both DiBiase and his brother. The Giant did an interview, leading to Hogan and Kevin Nash coming out. Savage then came out and Hogan kind of belittled him and told him to leave. He acted like he would, and then shoved Hogan into Giant. It wound up with Hogan destroying Giant with the bat until Sting made the save and dropped Hogan with the Scorpion Death Drop and took the bat back. Booker T kept the TV title, pinning Mortis in 4:27 of a very good match. They invented a couple of new moves and there was one 6 spot where T dropped Mortis almost on his head doing a power bomb off the middle ropes. Booker T was really over with the crowd as well because he did a lot of local promotion in New Orleans for this show. Then came another Ric Flair Bret Hart segment. Still think they're rushing their first meeting, but it was probably the best part of the show again. Chris Jericho beat Juventud Guerrera in 4:47 with the crab. Jericho didn't get as much reaction as you'd think. He continued to attack Guerrera afterwards until Mysterio Jr. ran in. Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera did some double team moves. Now are they teaming or feuding, or does anyone really keep track? On Jericho that were tremendous, including Guerrero basically throwing Mysterio Jr. into the air, and he hit a Frankensteiner off the top on Jericho that was amazing. Lex Luger beat Hall via DQ in 7:44 when Randy Savage interfered in a dud match, including the worst reverse atomic drop of the past 5 years. Usually Luger's missed by about a foot, but this missed by far more than that. Zbyszko tried to make the save, but he was double teamed until Luger made the save for him. Finally, Giant pinned Hogan with a choke slam in 6:07 when Hogan was distracted by Savage. Of course, the wrestling was beyond horrible. Nash came out and attacked both Giant and Savage. Nash went to jackknife Savage, but it was broken up by Giant, but it wound up with the entire NWO beating on Giant and Luger until Sting made the save and the three of them cleaned house. After the show was over, they did an impromptu match with Luger and Giant and Sting beating Conan and Bagwell and Hogan and Savage. Davey Boy Smith was backstage at the show. His WCW start was held up a few weeks as there were complications in his getting his release from WWF. As it was all settled, Smith and Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart will have the right to tag up, but not to use the Hart Foundation name, which is owned by the WWF. At one point they were considering, and probably still are considering, doing a feud with Flair and Benoit and Steve McMichael versus the Can't Use the Term Hart Foundation, but there was some concern because the idea was to use Hart and Smith as faces, and in this program they would be the heels. Smith and Neidhart were both dressed in their ring gear, but the decision was made not to use them on television because even though Flair worked as a heel in the angle with Neidhart and Hart, everyone cheered Flair and they didn't want Smith to debut getting booed. I'll presume Smith will be on within the week. Expect Louis Spicolli to join the NWO, probably in a Vincent-like flunky role. The date for the Nassau Coliseum Nitro is June 15th, which will come the day after the Great American Bash pay-per-view on June 14th, in Baltimore. Perry Saturn suffered a concussion in his match with Booker T on January 12th Nitro. Media Week is preparing a story on Bischoff. Bryan Adams, Crush, and Mike Gossett, Mike Graham were backstage at the Thunder tapings on January 15th in Lakeland, Florida. Adams just got his WWF release and should be starting here imminently, while Gossett may got his old job back as a road agent/booker. First day Cow Palace ticket sales for February 22nd Super Brawl were about 6,000 tickets and $208,000. Thunder on January 15th drew a 3.7 rating, 3.3 first hour, 4.0 seconds hour, and 5.5 share for the live show, and in 0.9 rating and 3.6 share for the replay. WCW was thrilled with the live number because the show itself was a disaster due to repeated annoying transmission problems, yet the second hour rating actually grew. The announce team changed once again, this time with Mike Tenay doing play-by-play with Bobby Heenan and Lee Marshall doing color and Tony Schiavone doing interviews. Tenay seemed uncomfortable at first, and under the circumstances with the transmission going out, the monitor going out, etc., it turned into a no-win situation, although he did a great job in the final 2 matches. The show drew 5,384, 3,689 paying $73,190. Show started with a Giant interview. Lodi held up a sign and Giant went after him. The entire flock attacked Giant, who cleaned house on all of them until Nash threw coffee in his eyes and started daring him to hit him all the way to the back. Steiners and Ray Traylor beat Black Cat and Ghetto and Michiyoshi Ohara in 7:04 when Scott pinned Ghetto with the SSD. Scott wouldn't tag out and Rick looked perplexed. Ernest Miller pinned Yuji Nagata with a great-looking kick off the top in 3:34. Bad match but hot finish. They did an angle where Diamond Dallas Page was injured. They've done so many injury angles with Page, Flair and Mysterio Jr. that it's gotten ridiculous. But he said he'd still come out of the main event and be Lex Luger's partner, and J.J. Dillon made him sign a release. Hall was to wrestle Louis Spicolli, but Spicolli acted like Hall was his hero. Zbyszko ended up out there and Spicolli jumped him, but Zbyszko cleaned house on both of them. Jericho beat Eddie Guerrero in 4:28 of a so-so match with a great finish with Jericho blocking a Hurricane Rana and turning it into a crab for the submission. In a match that epitomized the change in pro wrestling, Chavo Guerrero Jr. came out. Then Disco Inferno came out in his clothes and began dancing. The two exchanged words with Disco saying nobody was there to see Chavo wrestle. They were there to see him dance. This got a total face reaction. Guerrero fired back with what should be a face reply and was booed out of the building. Disco then jumped Chavo and gave him a chartbuster stunner, which got a total face reaction even though it was set up as a heel spot. Then Bill Goldberg ran out and used the jackhammer on Disco, which also got a face reaction. Mysterio Jr. pinned Guerrero to win the Cruiserweight title in 9:47 when Guerrero went for the Firebird 450 splash, but Mysterio Jr. moved. Guerrero landed on his feet, but Mysterio Jr. then hit the Hurricane Rana. Best major promotion match thus far this year, 4 1/4 stars. He'll probably drop it to Jericho on the pay-per-view. Finally, Savage and Nash versus Luger and Page. Page came out on crutches but Hogan attacked him and left him laying, turning it into a handicap match that ended in 3:45 when Hogan interfered for the DQ, only to get racked. Savage and Nash were fighting each other as much as Luger. Some really well-timed post-match shenanigans involving Savage coming off the top and hitting Luger, and acting pissed about it when Nash moved. When Luger moved, Hogan kicked Savage. Wound up with Giant and Sting making the save, and after the show went off the air, Sting pinned Hall in a singles match with the NWO, Giant and Luger all involved in out-of-the-ring shenanigans, using the death drop. The Page vs. Eddie Guerrero match taped to air on Saturday night on January 17th was edited off the show at the last minute because the booking committee forgot about that match already having been taped when formulating the Page injury angle. Only regular house show was January 18th in Shreveport, Louisiana, which drew an amazing 8,112 paying $134,656. While for today's climate, that doesn't sound that amazing, but it is when you consider the main events were Page vs. Bagwell, Benoit vs. Riggs and Giant vs. Hall. Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude have disappeared. Hennig suffered a knee injury a few weeks back that may require surgery. Don't know what the status of Rude is, nor what happened regarding his legal situation after the Buffalo incident. Originally, Hennig was going to interfere in the Flair Hart pay-per-view match to set up a triangle feud, but I'm guessing that'd be change. Thunder will remain on Thursday through the end of March, at which point things will get screwed up due to baseball season. There will be no Thunder the week of April 2nd, then it'll air on Thursday, April 9th and April 16th, then move to Wednesday on April 22nd, and once again not air the week of April 30th. The Spring Stampede pay-per-view will be April 19th from McNichols Arena in Denver. WWF. Juanita McMahon, who was Vince McMahon Sr.'s second wife, passed away on January 17th from liver cancer at the age of 81. She had been in poor health for more than 1 year. Vince McMahon Jr. was the product of a previous marriage and was raised in his youth by his mother. Her death was noted at the beginning of Raw. But perhaps in the weirdest irony, before the second hour of Raw began, they noted the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., since it was the national holiday to commemorate his birth. Martin Luther King Jr., who preached nonviolence and race relations, and today's WWF, built around racial gangs and violence. Raw on January 19th from Fresno, California drew a sellout 7,329 paying $123,064. Paul Bearer opened and said that everything that had happened the past 2 weeks was a ruse he had pulled and that he and Kane were always together, and The Undertaker was gone. Undertaker never appeared on the show although they kept teasing he would. DOA went to a DDQ with Nation of Domination, Farouk and D. Low Brown, in 440. Match was better than expected. And then D. Low tagged out. Fans hated the finish. Mark Henry and Maivia did a run-in at the end until Shamrock and Johnson made the save. Mero pinned Brandy after a low blow and TKO in 3:30. Sable got flowers at ringside. Mero jumped all over her for it and ended up shoving the flowers down Brandy's throat after the match. Real good short match, but there's something about Brandy in this role of being the gallant gentleman that isn't clicking. The Quebecers, Jacques Roger Jr. and Carl-Pierre Ouellette, who signed new contracts this past week, reported in Canada as being for 4 years, although we don't have that confirmed, returned beating Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie via DQ in 3:18 when Jack put the claw on the ref. Pretty entertaining. Funk did a Vader bomb outside the ring on both Quebecers and later Jacques backdropped Pierre over the top rope onto Jack. Jack then cleaned house with a barbed wire baseball bat. Jeff Jarrett retained the NWA North American title beating Blackjack Bradshaw in 3:41. Rock and Roll Express, wearing tag belts this time, although never called NWA Tag Team Champions, were at ringside and interfering freely. Blackjack Wyndham was at ringside as well but seemingly asleep while all the interference was going on. Bradshaw worked a lot stiffer and more aggressive after his Japan stint. Wyndham did a run-in and went to hit Jarrett, but instead gave Bradshaw the lariat when Wyndham moved leading to the pin. Rock and Rolls and Jarrett were beating on Bradshaw after the match when Wyndham teased saving him, then turned on him and Jim Cornette announced that the former NWA champion Barry Windham had rejoined the NWA. Windham looked like he was asleep, which matches the way he's been wrestling. They did a spot where Undertaker was descending from the ceiling, but it was actually Michaels dressed as him, and then he did an interview saying he doesn't lay down for anyone, roasting weenies and salamis and making all kinds of dick comments, including Triple H with a sewn Stark the Cook shirt. Michaels even took a weenie and acted like he was jacking it off. Owen Hart and Takamichi Inoku and Headbangers beat Los Boricuas in 3:01 when Owen put the sharpshooter on Jesus. Maivia beat Johnson in 2:44 of a terrible match when Henry interfered, leading to Maivia using the urinage for the finish. Something about Johnson that makes Maivia all of a sudden look like he hasn't really improved a lick. Shamrock made the save. Outlaws beat Godwins in 4:54 to keep the tag title. Something must have been wrong with Jean because he never tagged in once. Gunn hit Phineas with a stuffed animal, which had a brick stuffed in it, for the pin. Awful. Then came the Tyson angle. Some notes on the rest of the show. There was a tag team called Big Time that got a tryout. Southern California indie wrestlers Mick Tierney, who has wrestled as the Irish Assassin, got a tryout beating Christopher Daniels. Aguila had a match and after his win was jumped by Christopher. The Minis apparently had a great short match. Max versus Torito. It's good they kept Austin off until the end of the show because he was getting overexposed the past few weeks. Notes from the tapings on January 20th in Davis, California. Big Grimes beat Aaron O'Grady, two local wrestlers from the All Pro Wrestling promotion, in a tryout match which I'm told was the best match on the entire show and got a great crowd reaction as they both did some wild moves with O'Grady in particular looking real good. Two blonde bodybuilders, names not clear due to poor PA, got a tryout and looked bad in a squash. Irish Assassin again beat Christopher Daniels. Assassin got a good reaction doing almost a Bill Goldberg stiff shoot style. Raw started with Shamrock vs. Henry, which was an awful match due to Henry ending in a DQ when Maivia interfered, winding up with DOA and Johnson and the entire Nation of Domination all fighting. Lots of teasing of dissension between Maivia and Farouk. Jarrett and Wyndham beat LOD in a weird match. Match was boring with Morton, Gibson and Cornette in the corner. Wyndham hit Animal with the tennis racket while Morton and Gibson were fighting with Hawk and pinned him. The bell rang and they were announced as the winners, although apparently it was a screw-up as everyone acted weird and just kept wrestling looking mad. Later Bradshaw attacked Wyndham for a DQ on LOD, who were mad at Bradshaw for costing them the match. Vader beat Goldust via DQ when he used the Vader bomb but then Kane hit the ring. Vader actually was given some offense on Kane, but was then distracted by Goldust and Kane jumped him. Kane was supposed to tombstone Vader but lost control of him and had to go to the ropes to get his balance back and deliver the move, which may require some editing, and Vader was left laying. Outlaws beat Charlie and Jack via DQ when they beat up the ref in a good brawl. After the match Funk buried Jom under chairs and moonsaulted him. Pantera pinned Christopher to get the title shot with Taka on the February 15th pay-per-view. Christopher missed the leg drop off the top and was pinned in a decent match. Bangers beat Quebecers in a match with no heat. Instead of the promised Owen vs. Triple H, It was Owen versus Goldust dressed up as Triple H with a blonde wig and large fake nose, with Luna dressed up as China. The crowd felt like they'd been ripped off. Match ended when Owen wins using the sharpshooter, but DX got on the video wall and made fun of him for wasting his time beating a copy. Slaughter then told DX the joke was on them, and since Triple H was supposed to be in the match, he wasn't. That Owen was the new European champion. Will wonders ever cease? Another WWF title changes hands with the champion not having to do a job. Show ended with an Austin interview regarding Tyson, challenging him to show up in Houston for a fight. For Shotgun, Taka beat Jesus Castillo in a pretty bad match. Bradshaw won a squash. Kane pinned Michael Modest. Max and Nova beat Battalion and Torito in a short comedy match. Scott Taylor beat Black Phantom in a match where Taylor totally botched up his finishing DDT. Chains beat Jarrett via DQ in a non-title match when the NWA interfered and the DOA made the save. And in the final dark match, Shamrock and LOD beat Maivia and Outlaws when Shamrock made Maivia submit to the ankle lock in 9 minutes of a match of mainly stalling. They've been doing hotline teases based on trying to make money off false stories in wrestling, and there is certainly never going to be a shortage of that. Last week they teased a call about Hogan in the Rumble, and then indignantly said he wasn't and there had been no negotiations. The Savage Hotline story went exactly the same. As mentioned in the Mexican section, Sean Morley signed this past week. Adam Copeland went to Japan for New Tokyo Pro Wrestling. The feeling after the camp is that Morley and Copeland are going to be major stars and get a huge push once they debut on television. They're internally called the Two Blue Chippers. The guys from the camp worked a Massachusetts Wrestling Alliance show on January 10th in Plastow, New Hampshire. Kurgan vs. Sean Stasiak was said to have been bad. Kurgan looked bad. Stasiak was said to have had some problems but showed potential. Tiger Ali Singh showed good heel charisma in a pre-match interview, although Mark Henry was 2 steps slow in everything they tried in their match. Steve Blackman looked impressive against Matt Bloom, who has worked on New England Indies for Kowalski as the Mongolian, who moved well for his size and had good power moves. Bobby Duncombe Jr. will be getting a tryout next month. He's improved to where he's a little below average uncharismatic 6'5" guy, which also describes a good percentage of the company's roster these days. After the camp, Dory Funk was also signed to a contract with WWF to serve as a trainer and coach. There is no definite date set for another camp, but everyone was too positive about that they'll definitely be doing them regularly. It was said to have been a cross between a Japanese dojo-type training and some drills from college football, with everyone spending 4 or 5 hours per day in the ring. Weekend house shows saw January 16th in Anaheim draw $12,783 and $208,761, and January 17th in Las Vegas drew $3,822 and $68,479. Merchandise for the weekend was $358,001 or $8.82 per head. Reports from both shows were pretty bad. The new policy appears to be very short matches with not much of a work rate, which may be to protect against the injury problems that plagued the company last year. Lots of complaints again about Michaels in LA. Apparently he spit in a fan's face first, according to several witnesses, then the fan spit back and was tossed. Jarrett was back in action for all the weekend shows. Lineups for February 12th in Miami and February 14th in Tampa is Austin and Jack vs. Rocky and Farouk, Hart and Shamrock vs. Michaels and Triple H, Vader vs. Goldust, Outlaws defend vs. LOD, Kane vs. Chains, Bangers vs. Godwins, Taka defends against Christopher, Skull and 8-Ball vs. Perez, and Vega and Mero vs. Brandy. The Mexican wrestlers that have signed are getting $300 per week minimums plus a certain amount per house show and television, and $2,000 if they are booked on a pay-per-view. Generally in San Jose the morale wasn't that good despite the great business. The feeling from several is the scars from November really haven't healed with a lot of people, even though everyone pretends they have, in that almost nobody trusts management at all now. In WCW the mid-card morale is bad because nobody thinks there's any upward mobility like they have in WWF. Wrestling Observer Newsletter, January 26, 1998. First class mail. 1,228 U.S. postage paid. Campbell, California 95009-1228, permit number 5634. San Jose, California